Hi, I'm Jeremy Brecker with the Labor Network for Sustainability, and in this installment of Strike, Commentaries on Solidarity and Survival, we will be talking about the Great Depression and the coronavirus depression. In the first year of the coronavirus pandemic and the ensuing coronavirus depression, people power played a little acknowledged but critical role in protecting health and economic well-being. Despite change in the national political context, they are continuing into the Biden era. Movements utilizing people power direct action may be just as important in this era. Indeed, given the sharp divisions within the system of institutionalized political power, such actions may play an even more important role. While dramatic events in Washington held national attention, the weeks following Joe Biden's election also saw a series of people power actions around the country. On Martin Luther King Jr. Day, workers in more than 15 cities struck at McDonald's, Taco Bell, Burger King, and other fast food restaurants as part of Fight for 15 and a union. Chicago teachers defied the city's school board and refused to return to work under conditions they considered unsafe. Nurses held a day of action with demonstrations in more than a dozen states, calling for personal protective equipment, COVID testing, adequate staffing, and sick leave. In Olympia, Washington, advocates for the unhoused saying it's too cold for people to be sleeping on the streets, especially during a pandemic, purchased 17 rooms in the downtown Red Lion Hotel. When homeless people from nearby encampments tried to occupy the rooms, police drove them out. Workers at the Hunts Point Terminal Produce Market in New York City struck for a week, suffered police arrests while peacefully picketing, and eventually won a $1.85 an hour raise and 40 cents an hour employer contribution for health care. Since the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic in early 2020, there have been many such sporadic but significant outbursts of popular self-organization and people power action. Unemployed organizing brought together thousands of people in online networks and in the streets to demand fixing of dysfunctional state unemployment systems. Wildcat Strikes, reportedly over 1,000 since the start of the pandemic, demanded personal protective equipment, COVID-safe workplaces, and extra pay for essential workers. Strikes and threats to strike by teachers throughout the country have demanded classes be held only in COVID-safe schools. Thousands participated in rent strikes and other housing actions. 15 million people participated in Black Lives Matter demonstrations, the largest protests in American history, and Black Lives Matter strikes were backed by some of America's biggest unions. In December, a Los Angeles coalition brought together healthcare, labor, and community organizations that represented tens of thousands of Los Angeles workers, including frontline healthcare workers, pre-K to 12th grade teachers and university educators, grocery store workers, hospitality workers, educational, housing, and racial justice advocates, to demand a 4-week circuit breaker lockdown with safety nets for businesses, workers, and families so that they could safely stay home. Hundreds of thousands survived the hardships of the coronavirus depression through self-organized mutual aid. Public policy has been strongly impacted by such people power action. Thousands of companies and local governments have been forced to provide personal protective equipment and introduce protective public health policies. Teachers' demands, strikes, and pressure tactics have played a major role in shaping both public health and educational policy, shutting down schools and determining the conditions under which they can reopen. Fight for 15 strikes encouraged many states to pass $15 minimum wage legislation and helped lead the Biden administration to include a $15 minimum wage as part of its American Rescue Bill. These actions provide an essential background for understanding the surprising start of Joe Biden's presidency. This conservative, pro-corporate politician, known for his opposition to health care for all, has been described, with only modest exaggeration, as taking more progressive action in his first 8 days in office than Barack Obama did in his whole 8 years. He has identified the great crises of our time: climate, pandemic, economic hardship, white supremacy, and now the crisis of democracy. He has pledged his Build Back Better program will address them. Maybe he had a vision on the road to Damascus, but more likely he is responding to the pressures from below, manifested not only in electoral action, but in campaigns for COVID protection, strikes and strike threats, Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and teacher and community protests for school safety. His future trajectory is likewise likely to be shaped in part by the strength of such pressures from below. At the start of 2021, as political power appears poised between Dr. No Republicans and Democrats divided on whether to push for change or a return to normalcy, people power may make a critical difference in how we address the multiple crises of climate, pandemic, economic depression, white supremacy, and democracy. Beyond that, it can help lay the groundwork for deeper reforms and a more far-reaching Green New Deal. The history of the original New Deal offers some hints of how this could happen. In the early days of the Great Depression of the 1930s, hundreds of thousands of people participated in hunger marches, unemployed organizations, various forms of self-help mutual aid, street protests, anti-eviction riots, farm holiday blockades, and occupations of city halls and state capitals. Their purpose was to force local, state, and federal governments and elites to address the needs of those hit by economic catastrophe. Their role was critical, both before and after the 1932 elections that led to democratic political control and the proclamation of the New Deal. It helped lay the groundwork for the greatest period of social reform since the Civil War and the greatest period of worker organization ever. Franklin D. Roosevelt entered the presidency as a fiscal conservative, pledged to balance the budget with no specific plans to counter the Great Depression. His New Deal began as a program of reform oriented more towards saving American business than to rescuing its people. Among his first acts were to cut government salaries and veterans' benefits, but unemployed and worker movements continued to force local, state, and national governments to address hardship and enormously expand relief. Pressure from below, from the likes of the unemployed, workers, and farmers, had already turned a silent emergency into a threat to the status quo. Roosevelt responded with a series of emergency relief measures designed to limit hardship, limit protest, and limit the downward spiral of depression. The New Deal era represented a historic realignment in American politics as urban ethnic groups, rural communities, African Americans, workers, and others hard hit by the Great Depression flooded into the Democratic Party, creating what came to be known as the New Deal coalition. But direct action from below was a significant factor in many of the major initiatives of the early New Deal. The threat of action by the unemployed laid the groundwork for emergency programs like the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERA, the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, and the Works Progress Administration, WPA. The Farm Holiday Movement helped call forth the Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA. But the effect of pressure from below didn't stop there. The unemployed, union organizing, strike, and old age pension movements, combined with the mass movements led by demagogic populist leaders like Louisiana Governor Huey Long and radio priest Father Charles Coughlin, led Roosevelt in 1935-36 to opt for a cascade of more radical programs, often referred to by historians as the Second New Deal. The old age pension movement, led by Dr. Francis Townsend, and the Labor and Unemployed campaign for the Workers' Unemployment Insurance Bill, laid the groundwork for Social Security. The 1934 strikes and general strikes created the pressures that led to the National Labor Relations Act and the growth of industrial unionism. Roosevelt successfully backed passage of the modest Wealth Tax Act of 1935 to steal the thunder of the Share Our Wealth progressive taxation movement backed by Huey Long. Mass mobilization by workers and the unemployed helped save Social Security from gutting by Republicans in Congress. It also helped limit the power and appeal of white supremacist, right-wing, and fascist movements that repeatedly threatened to erupt into national prominence. The period of dramatic New Deal reforms was short-lived. In 1936, the Supreme Court began declaring major New Deal programs unconstitutional. Starting in 1937, a conservative coalition in Congress between Republicans and Southern Democratic Dixiecrats put an end to passage of New Deal legislation, while many of the demands of mass movements were met or deflected. Such movements, above all the burgeoning labor movement, continued to use people power to address the needs of those at the bottom. In the stories I heard in my youth from old New Dealers, there were often two sets of enemies. One were the right-wingers, most of the Republican Party, the Liberty Leaguers, anti-labor corporations, HUAC, the FBI, and racists and anti-Semites of many varieties. But there was another set of enemies, the New Deal coalition's enemies within. They included the Herbert Hoover-initiated Reconstruction Finance Corporation, Roosevelt-backed FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, and the Southern white supremacists in the Democratic Party. In the argot of the day, they were often referred to as phony New Dealers, opportunistically hiding under the popular mantle of the Roosevelt administration, while actually striving to undermine its most progressive policies and proponents. Roosevelt was the arbiter and at the same time the target of these struggles within the New Deal coalition. He was also complicit with some of the most reactionary policies promulgated in the name of the New Deal, notably those promoted by racist Southern senators and congressmen. In a period of reform, there may also be corporate and other powerful forces which want to support some aspects of a reform program. They may do so from fear of more radical challenge or of social chaos, from recognition of major social problems that threaten the whole of society, or from specific gains that may be made by an individual company or sector. In the 1930s, some elites supported federal relief programs because they feared riot and even revolution. Many supported the National Recovery Administration, NRA, because they felt something was necessary to combat the Great Depression. Some companies, for example General Electric, supported expanded labor rights because unionization would give their large, technologically advanced companies an advantage over their smaller, technologically backward competition. Similarly, today, some sectors of business support some parts of Biden's reform program. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce applauded the Biden rescue plan, but said it shouldn't last too long. Many New Deal programs would never have been passed and implemented without such support, but dependence on such forces also puts a limit to how far reforms can go. It can be tough to know when to cooperate with such forces and when to fight them, but both are likely to be necessary. Within such a complex arena of struggle, action by those affected by hardship shows the public, the media, and politicians that government response is essential and urgent. It is easy to ignore a million hungry people, but it is not easy to ignore a million hungry people who are pressing their demands at government offices and in the streets. Such action demonstrates to politicians that there are needy constituencies that can be appealed to, and that if one politician or political force doesn't appeal to them, their competitors may do so. As one old New Dealer told me regarding the second New Deal, Roosevelt had to keep out front in the fight for social progress, or people would quickly look for other leaders, like Huey Long and Father Coughlin. That same dynamic might apply in the era of the coronavirus depression. To read this commentary, please visit laborforsustainability.org/strike.